Japanese city pop, or as the Japanese called it, city pop. If you clicked on this video, you've probably vibed to it before, with vivid images of yourself riding in your brand new 1980s Toyota convertible, top down, wind blowing through your perm, a retro Japanese cityscape behind you, and your partner in legal crime smiling next to you in the passenger seat.
Look at the size of that trunk. You could put 3 bodies in there. Just kidding.
So why am I making this video? Well, I'll tell you. There's probably less than a dozen people in the world that lost sleep over what I found. And I represent over half of that dozen. I'm a musical explorer. And you probably are too. Popular genres spread like wildfire, right? Look at what hip-hop did. One day, I began to wonder what Korean city pop might be like. Koreans had to have had their own rendition, right? They're like 20 feet away from Japan. The first time I searched for Korean city pop on the YouTube search was 5 years ago. That search returned 0 results. Alright, whatever, who cares? When I searched again a couple years later, there were some results, but it was less than a handful. And when I listened to those playlists, did some digging, all of those Korean city pop artists, they're from today. Those songs were recorded and released within just years ago. Korean city pop right now is largely a newer revival, a reinterpretation of the original Japanese city pop. So was there no city pop in Korea in the 80s during its heyday? I'm a curious George. When I see a gap in knowledge or information, I get a little healthy anxiety. I need to fill that void with drugs, alcohol, and maybe even some answers. If you're half as curious as to how a musical genre as dominant in that region can just leapfrog its neighbors, you're watching the right video. First of all, let's give some props to Japan. And to do that, we have to define exactly why city pop hits different. How does it captivate so many people today? And how does it transport you to a time and place you were never even a part of? City pop emerged in the late 1970s in Japan. It reached its height in the 80s. It was essentially a blend of jazz, funk, disco, and soul. But unlike popular music, Japan wasn't afraid to incorporate some musical complexity. Their city pop had lush, sophisticated chords, taken right out of jazz. Rather than chords that comprised of, say, 3 notes, they weren't afraid to use major 7ths, minor 9ths, and 13ths. And if you don't know what that means, it just means that there are more notes per chord. That's what chords sound like when you listen to neo-soul and jazz, and what makes those chords sound so lush. But it wasn't just the chords. It was the composition. A lot of pop genres, they use simple, catchy chord progressions. Japan's city pop, they often use more novel and complex sequences, unexpected modulations, secondary dominance, and borrow chords from outside the primary key. And if you don't know what that means, it's not really important. It basically just means that they were more musical and better. I can't tell you how many producers I met in LA that dealt primarily in popular music, whether that be singing or rap, that said that they wished they could be more musical sometimes in their production. Well, the Japanese listeners of the 80s were more than sophisticated enough to appreciate that musicality, as do all of us now, today. But the soul of city pop represented a vibrant energy, an opulent lifestyle of urban living. It really represented the spirit of Japan. If any of you heard of the Japanese economic miracle, you might be able to see already how intertwined city pop is with Japan's rapid economic boom of that time. In a difficult post-war period for Japan, they catapulted themselves with technological advancements, consumer culture, globalization, media expansion, and an overall shift in lifestyles. So a few other nations have done the same in their history. What made Japan stand out? Well, during that time and the centuries before, the world's economic poverty problem was the continent of Asia. Asia was the poorest continent by at least 2 times until really only recent years. Japan's ability to distinguish themselves economically amidst an environment of their poor neighbors can easily explain why only Japan had the environment and the situation that could birth an opulent genre like city pop. And it explains why that genre would leapfrog its neighbors that were still dealing with centuries-old poverty. If that answers all your curiosities, then this is where the video ends for you. Thanks for coming, you're beautiful. But if you're like me and you need to know Korea's side of the story, then we got an interesting few minutes left. One of the terms that Korea was known as was the hermit nation. They just wanted to do their thing and be left alone. They were like the Switzerland of Asia. For most of Korea's history, they were mostly an agrarian, philosophical, artistic, and simpler society. But most importantly, game devs spawned them between two of the most expansionary-minded nations in history, China and Japan. Korea often found their land as the battleground for surrounding nations, or as the first step of Japan's many invasion campaigns, meaning that the few times Korea was actually about to gain some traction as far as economics or power, they were swiftly dogpiled. So while Japan was basking in the light of their economic boom post-World War II, Korea was still a third world country, except for one weird time period. Between 1988 and 1992, Korea was once again starting to gain some traction economically. They were hosting the Summer Olympics in '88, and things were looking on the up and up. During that period, there are a few Korean city pop records. But, as is Korean tradition, Korea was entering another phase of economic uncertainty. And at the same time, musical tastes were changing, and something really unexpected was about to happen. K-pop. Korea in the 90s was a period of rapid growth. They finally got their hands on some basic technology, and they became profoundly more aware of what was going on in the rest of the world. The young generations of the time finding cultural aspects that they resonated with in the youth of other cultures. This was a time where cultures all over the world were finding each other and borrowing from each other endlessly. Think of the Wu-Tang Clan. Like 80% of their beats use samples from old kung fu and karate flicks. And the Nigerian youth discovered American rap music. Story goes on. Everybody was fusing, like Latin fusion, which blended Latin American rhythms with rock, pop, and hip hop. And for anyone who's already had their first gray hair, you'll remember that that time hip hop and R&B were collaborating a lot more. You couldn't find a hip hop album without an R&B record on it, and you couldn't find an R&B album without a hip hop collab on it. And most important to me personally, neo soul was born. But for a lot of this time period, Korea was still a backwater. At this point in the story, we have to talk about one of the most badass chapters in Asian American history, and it involves martial arts. Before Bruce Lee came and beat the crap out of his colleagues, Kung Fu masters had a mentality of being sick and tired of sharing their culture with the West, a sentiment that would probably be shared with a lot of indigenous American people. When China started trading with the West and sharing their culture, it directly led to the Opium Wars. That's what knocked China from world power to poverty, and what rose the West from poverty to world power. Ethnic Chinese people in America, they didn't have it any better. They suffer from some of the largest mass lynchings and the like. So any ethnic Chinese in America, it wouldn't be unusual to find them being wary about opening up to other people. But Korea's story was a little different. Korea had never fallen from grace in the same way China or Japan did. They were almost always in a position of looking up to the world, not down. We're talking about martial arts. That brings us to Taekwondo. Taekwondo was a pretty new martial art at that time. And when Taekwondo masters were coming to America from Korea, they came with this damn near evangelist mindset. They wanted to show the world that helped them during the Korean War that they have something to offer as well. It might not be money, but it was their fighting spirit, their undying friendship, and their culture. I've seen footage of these Taekwondo masters having non-stop exhibitions demonstrating their martial art to try to gain interest in the country. So while a lot of martial arts masters were wary to share their art, Korea was more than happy to. And those Korean martial arts masters abused their body, broke their body in that campaign. Why does that martial arts story matter? Well, earlier we talked at length about the Japanese spirit. We can't talk about Korean music without talking about the Korean spirit. Everywhere I go, I hear the same thing. Koreans go hard. Whether it was in the breakdancing competitions of the 90s and thousands, or from some homies in the street talking about how different gangs operate, Koreans go hard was always the sentiment. I think that fighting spirit is how this little oppressed nation became a force today. Korea's prominence today is thanks to generations of artists, innovators, visionaries who refused to be confined by their circumstances. Korea had never fallen from grace. They were always in the gutter. And on a very rare occasion in Korea's history, they had an opportunity to grow and develop as they would without constant threat of invasion, occupation, and war on their lands. When Korea jumped into second and first world status, city pop, funk, jazz, disco, all of that was out of style. Now, it was all about hip hop. Korean hip hop at the outset was actually very pure, very fun, and very good. But as the corporations always do, they came over and watered everything down and steered that ship towards more pop music. And for some years, not great pop music. This is a story that I'm not supposed to tell, but I was working for some producers in LA, and they talk about how when they made a pop beat that didn't get picked up, maybe it wasn't quite hot enough for the United States, they would just ship it over to Korea, get a quick 8K for some major supplementary income. Basically, Korea was given America's throwaway beats in the pop genre. But when talking about the city pop era, it's not like Korea had no music during that time period. So I wondered, what was Korean music during the heyday of Japanese city pop? It was trot music, ballads, rock music. In fact, some of my favorite psychedelic rock music came from Korea around that time. It was folk music and new wave. But while city pop was a genre reflecting excess and economic success, Korean music was about more of the typical stuff. Love, loss, oppression. And if you're wondering what trot and new wave music was, that was basically their twerking music at the time. But today, Korean city pop exists, but it's more of a reinterpretation. And I think that that's a beautiful thing for one main reason. Korea and Japan had one of the most conflict-riddled histories I think I've ever read about out of any colonizer-colonizee relationship. And for a lot of their history, Korea and Japan have both gone to great lengths to separate their cultural identity as far away from the other as possible. But here is a time where you see cooperation and collaboration between the two. Look at XG. Look at these Korean artists reinterpreting Japanese art forms and vice versa. If you're still watching this video, chances are you've seen some of my XG reactions. I went ahead and looked at some other reaction videos from XG's releases. And I saw a lot of Korea versus Japan comments talking about, oh, Korea's Japan's slave, Korea belongs to Japan, blah, blah, blah. And I gotta be honest, I find it to be really ironic that they're having all that talk and all that battle in the comment section of arts that are the direct product of the two nations vibing with each other, building with each other. This music history journey gave me one priceless thing, an appreciation for a lot of the Korean knuckleheads I grew up around. Growing up, I was a kid raised by many villages, and none of these villages were really Korean people, unfortunately. Whenever I did run into old Korean heads, I noticed that they really weren't effing with me or any other westernized Korean. And I began to realize that this disdain for me came from Korean pride. But this pride was the pride of people who faced the threat of being wiped out of history countless times. It was only their fighting spirit that made them one of the longest progressing, unbroken cultural histories that was not a serial colonizer. Generations fought and died just for Koreans today to be able to say, I know where I come from. And here I was, someone who did not know where my ethnic roots came from until just a few years ago. I'm sure just the sight of me must have really spontaneously triggered their menstrual cycles, and I get that now. Like I said earlier, I'm curious. I'd often ask my fellow ethnic Koreans about the culture, how to pronounce certain words, why this is, why that is, but instead of answering, they would just respond with an attitude. The fact that I didn't already know the answers, they didn't feel like helping me. If one of them would have taken the time to break it down for me, I'm 100% sure my appreciation for my Korean side would have kicked off a long time ago. Korea today has reached an interesting and rare place. A place where they are no longer consumers and copiers of developed nations, but they are influencers and inspirers to other people that they share this world with. If you're from New York or you're a hip-hop nerd, you know that hip-hop started off as consuming and enjoying already established music, using it to create something of their own. In that transition, hip-hoppers were accused of stealing, being uncreative, being unethical, but now the whole world is influenced by what hip-hop created. For a lot of years, I grew up in a Nigerian-American household, and I remember when Nigeria first discovered rap music, they were basically just regurgitating what they were hearing from the States. Be like carbon copies of Snoop Dogg's verses. They be rapping about Long Beach City, Rips and all that. And mind you, they've never been to Cali. I remember my Niger siblings cringing to it. But now, Nigerians have their own genre of music born out of all of that. And Nigeria influences people all around the world with their music and culture. And likewise, Korea is the most recent member of a special group of people who went from that oppression, poverty, being under the radar, to being exposed to the wide world, consuming its offerings like mad, to now giving something back of its own. Korea missed the city pop boat in the 80s, but they created a boat of their own. If you remember just one thing from this, remember that music is not just about the music. It's a reflection of the human experience, a mirror that reveals the stories of the people behind them.